Morning, we're going to begin in Mexico. That's where the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Hussein, said that from December 2006 to August of this year, more than 151,000 people have been killed there in Mexico. Now, he also said 27,000 more remain disappeared. Hussein condemned the 98% impunity rate in the country. The UN official calls on the government to accept criticism and to take steps to deal with what he calls a very grave crisis of human rights in Mexico. The human rights defender met with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and asked for him to gradually remove military forces from public safety operations.
Many of the issues raised by my predecessor 4 years ago remain of concern, and many of the people I have spoken to painted a very bleak and consistent picture of a society that is racked by high levels of insecurity, disappearances and killings, continuing harassment of human rights defenders and journalists, violence against women, and terrible abuses of migrants and refugees transiting the country on their way to the United States.
And now we go to our correspondent in Mexico, Clayton Conn, who has more on that crisis of human rights in Mexico, where torture and enforced disappearances are common practice.
After 3 days of meetings with officials and rights groups, UN Rights Commissioner Zeid Hussein gave his critical report on Mexico's human rights.
And many of the people I have spoken to painted a very bleak and consistent picture of a society that is racked by high levels of insecurity, disappearances and killings, continuing harassment of human rights defenders and journalists, violence against women, and terrible abuses of migrants and refugees.
Meanwhile, the official reaction to damning reports by international organizations has been to internally refute them, while at the same time applauding legislative measures that are a result of international pressure that at least rhetorically defend human rights and champion a transparent and responsible government.
At times we forget, we omit and let it pass, because at times our memory is short. But if we try to visualize Mexico 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we were a government authentically closed.
Yet, human rights defenders say that it is in fact the lack of transparency and impunity that continues to be a root cause of Mexico's human rights crisis, pointing to inaccurate data and statistics and opaque information gathered by the authorities.
I believe the problem crosses into issues of transparency, secrecy inside the local public prosecutor's offices, secrecy inside the Attorney General's office, secrecy by local courts, which impedes those of us worried about structural issues, even though we have a clear idea of what we are living here in Mexico.
Ultimately, civil society rights defenders argue that a militarization policy of Mexico's so-called war on drugs and systemic corruption sustain the human rights crisis. They also say that while there may be a degree of political legislative will to tackle the crisis, there's a complete lack of will to put these measures into practice. Clayton Conn, teleSUR, Mexico City.